Hi everyone, Steve here, and welcome to our latest instalment of our Coffee Conversations series, where we talk to Australian business leaders about the challenges and the opportunities stemming from the current environment. And today I'm privileged to be joined by Professor Ian Harper AO, who's Dean of the Melbourne Business School, in addition to being a board member of the Reserve Bank of Australia. So Ian, welcome, really good to see you again.
Nice to see you too, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. Now, as we've discussed this afternoon, it's all about having a chat over a coffee, a casual conversation. And although not in a face-to-face sense, as we may used to be doing, but more in that virtual sense as we're becoming more used to do well. So with that in mind, Ian, can I ask you to share what your drink of choice is this afternoon?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I love a cup of tea, particularly in the afternoon. And I've just got English breakfast, which takes a fair amount of beating. Melbourne breakfast is my next favourite, but I tend to have that in the evening. But, you know, Twinings or T2, English breakfast tea takes a bit of beating in my book.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And of course, I've similarly afternoons, so it's peppermint tea for me.
Oh, okay.
Well, caffeine just a little bit. But look, thanks once again for joining me today, and really appreciate your time. Perhaps before we explore things a little further, would you mind sharing with us a little bit of your own background?
Sure, Steve. Well, I'm a professional economist. I've been an economist really, since I was at university. I didn't want to do anything else, so I went straight on to take my PhD and then went and practiced as an economist, firstly at the Reserve Bank. So I started there nearly 40 years ago, and now I'm on the board, as you say. But most of that time I spent as an academic economist working at the Melbourne University, Melbourne Business School. Then I spent 10 years at Deloitte as a partner there with Deloitte Access Economics when the firm acquired Access Economics. And then I came from Deloitte Access Economics back again at the invitation of the university to be the Dean of the Melbourne Business School, where I now am.
Oh, very good. Which is a very good segue into my next question. And that's if you could share with us a little bit perhaps about those current roles, both as Dean of the Melbourne Business School and also as a non-executive board member of the RBA.
Sure. Happy to, Steve. Well, you look, obviously the universities have done it pretty tough, or are doing it pretty tough through the COVID pandemic, primarily because of the closure of the borders. And as many people who are listening to this program would understand, Australia's universities, not unlike universities in Europe or even the United States, but certainly here in Australia, have over the last decade or so enrolled enormous numbers of international students. And with the closure of the borders, those students simply can't arrive, or at least in nothing like the numbers that they have been arriving in the past. So the main university, the University of Melbourne, of which the Melbourne Business School is a part, has really been, quite heavily affected by the closure of the borders. And apart from that, of course, everybody's affected in the same way with the need to lock down, and all of that has had the same effect on the university as it has elsewhere, but this particular effect. The Melbourne Business School, on the other hand, we tend mostly to deal with domestic students. The great bulk of our students are part-time. They're doing their MBA degrees while they're working. So there's a small contingent of foreign students or international students, but the bulk of my students are domestic students, as a result of which we've been much less affected on that side. In fact, one of the fascinating things, Steve, about being in my game is that it is counter-cyclical, as academics say. So when times get tough out in the workplace, people go back to school. So my enrollments in our part-time MBA program for the September intake, which we're just about to start for the MBA degree at Melbourne Business School, have jumped 100%. Wow. They're double what they were at this time last year. So, it's the old adage, the going gets tough and the tough get going. On the other side of my business, which is executive education, where people, companies pay for people to come on courses and such like, well, of course, that's been, devastated. That's gone the other way. As companies have cut programs or deferred them and so on. So I've got a mix of challenges there. Good news on the award side of the business, as we call it. not so good news on the executive ed side, which is precisely why those two things were put together. When things turn, executive education does really well, and people say, I don't need to come to the university, I've got a job, and so on. So, you know, there's a natural hedge in combining those two things. But having said that, my friend, the school has a significant endowment, and we're drawing on that, as you would expect. And of course, we've also benefited from JobKeeper. Unlike the main university, the business school as a separate company has qualified for JobKeeper. And those two things have kept me in a much better shape than I might otherwise have been. As to the bank, well, you know, anybody who has followed what's been happening with monetary policy and the economy more broadly would quickly realize that the Reserve Bank board has had some, you know, significant challenges in what we've been thinking about. I joined the board just under, well, about 4.5 years ago. And obviously in that time, this is the most significant thing I've seen while I've been on the board, but to be frank, I didn't think I'd see anything like this in my career, let alone during my time on the board. So the board has had to make some pretty momentous decisions about how the bank will continue to support the economy and to try to achieve its objectives through this process. It wouldn't be any surprise to you or anybody else who's listening that the primary objectives of the bank, namely inflation and unemployment, by virtue of the circumstances we find ourselves in, the bank will be a way off its objectives there for some considerable time. And I'm not telling you any secrets. That's what the governor has also pointed out. But people might not know that in the Reserve Bank Act, the act which, you know, basically spells out what the board needs to do with the bank. Of course, inflation and unemployment are mentioned, but there's a third objective, and that is simply the economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia. And you might think, well, gee, there's just a bunch of words. Well, yeah, but what that does is to mean that the bank, when it can't get its narrower objectives online, can simply focus on doing what it needs to do to support the economic prosperity and welfare of the Australian people. And the governor's made this point in testimony to the Parliament. But as a board member, with my 8 colleagues around that board table, there are 9 on the board, it's often the case that we're thinking exactly about that, right? How do the actions of the bank, including simply making encouraging, statements about how we're travelling, and you'll hear the governor talk about building a bridge to the other side and this type of thing, is all important, as well as pulling whatever levers we have to pull. But it is, as they say, Steve, uncharted waters.
Indeed. Perhaps if I could just explore a little further, Ian, if you wouldn't mind. One of the challenges must be, given those uncharted waters, that, you know, we're all finding our way in different ways. But the challenges in, forecasting and modelling outcomes in the current environment must be substantial. How do you deal with those?
Well, Steve, let me back up and say, as you would appreciate, the bank has some of the finest economic forecasters there are around, right? I mean, we have the benefit of hiring, as does Deloitte Access Economics, I might add, given a bit of a plug for my former employer, the best and brightest. But with due respect to Deloitte Access Economics and other economic forecasters, you can't get the sort of experience you can inside the official family, either the bank or the Commonwealth Treasury. That's when you get it sort of in its undiluted form, because you're advising the government directly. Anyway, we have significant expertise in economic forecasting and a lot of machinery that goes into that. So what I'm about to say, in a sense, ought to give you a backup what you've just said, right? So how useful is all of this forecasting machinery when you've got uncharted waters, when you've not seen this sort of thing before, at least in recent times? I mean, we can dig it up from history, and of course we do dig it up from history, but lots of things have changed since the last time we had something as deep as this, which was in the 1930s. The answer, Steve, is that you construct scenarios. That's the normal way in which economists, at least, and corporate strategists are really no different. That you can't. I mean, the margin for error, if you like, is so wide that there's not a lot of point in saying, well, the number's going to be 6.3, and maybe it's 6 and maybe it's sort of 6.8. I mean, forget it, right? What the bank does, and you'll see this published in the statement on monetary policy that the bank prepares every quarter. You'll see since this process has started that the bank has been working on 3 major scenarios. As I might add, has Deloitte Access Economics and other economic forecasters. I mean, this isn't sort of unique to the bank. But you ask what we do, well, the answer is you start working on these scenarios. So, best case, sort of most likely, if you like, and worst case, and try and get some sense of the boundaries of this to get your sort of hands around it. And then you just watch and monitor as you go through, and you adjust here and there, and you get a bit of a sense of, how we're tracking relative to where we thought we might be. So broadly speaking, and people can read this in the Reserve Bank's documents for themselves. If you just sort of, in the broadest terms, if you think, well, the best sort of middle case, and then the worst scenario, we were tracking between the middle case and the best scenario, right? Until the second wave in Victoria. Okay. And that's now slipped us between the middle case and the worst, right? Not as bad as the worst, but sort of the wrong side of the middle most likely scenario. There's no doubt about that, because of the impact that the shutdown in Victoria, the second wave, I should say, plus the accompanying lockdown, obviously, has had on the Victorian economy, which is about a quarter of the national economy.
No, look, thanks for that. Perhaps if we could kind of finish on a positive note as well. And it's often said that every cloud has a silver lining, and that the corollary of challenge is opportunity.
Yeah.
Do you see any opportunities arising from our current environment, whether that be in the context of your role at the Dean of the Melbourne Business School, or with the RBA, or indeed in any other facet of your life or that you're experiencing as well? Yeah,
thanks, Steve. Look, mate, there clearly are, because as people are in a mindset that says, well, it's a new world. We have to try things, different things now. And the idea that, no, we're just going to go back to the way things were. Well, most people say that isn't going to happen. Now, you might think, well, of course, there's a downside of that, but there's also an upside, which is what you're pointing to. And you say, well, you don't have to have any discussions anymore about, well, this isn't the way we do things around here. Excuse me. Right. That's all sort of pre-pandemic. And the clearest example of that is at the business school and the university more broadly, but certainly in the business school. For years, my colleagues have been talking about the virtual business school and at what pace we should go online and what are the advantages and disadvantages. And then that argument went around and around, and some of it was self-serving. I don't want to put my courses online and do it all again. I don't know how to use that technology anyway, right? And others, of course, saying, yeah, this is the way of the future, all that sort of stuff. Well, mate, it took my colleagues 3 weeks from a standing start, right? 3 weeks to go from essentially nowhere in the Melbourne business, not completely nowhere, but essentially nowhere, to whoom, right, online. Now, to be fair, the first thing you do is you just go online with what you already had, right? So it's, if you like, it's the online version of what we would normally do, and people say, well, yes, but hang on a second, and then you get the reaction as people start saying, well, you could do it like this or do it like that, or it would be better if we did this way or that way, and you start to then get the modifications that come as people see the possibilities as well as the limitations of an online format, and it starts to morph, right? Which is what, of course, it's been doing in the intervening time. And so when we do go back, as it were, to normal, it'll be a different normal, that's for sure. And we've, for the first time, mate, to be completely specific, I said to you, I was enrolling another, twice as many students in September. Well, a whole bunch of those people are coming from elsewhere in the country. So for the first time, if people say, now I can do an MBA at Melbourne Business School, because they live in Brisbane, they got a job in Brisbane, maybe they're working for you, and I just can't go down. But now, right? And others, of course, pining for the classroom atmosphere. Well, we will have a blended mix of it. Now, to take the lens out again and think about the whole country, that is occurring in every industry where people are thinking, gee, do we have to travel as much? Do we have to have we can mix and match with the meetings? They don't have to be all in the one place. more flexible for women and people with childcaring responsibilities. All that type of thing opens up a whole lot of new possibilities. So I think the upside, Steve, is that I am very encouraged, and you would have heard Philip Lowe say similar things. A lot of economists say that there's nothing like this type of disruptive experience, throwing all the cards in the air, right? And the first reaction is, oh my God, right? But the next reaction is, actually, we can now do a bunch of things that people used to object to before. They suddenly become a good idea, or at least no one can say, forget that, we don't do it around here like that. All that's switched off. And out of there will be born innovation, right? New ideas, productivity growth, living standards. So the idea that somehow this is all going to take us to hell in a handcart, I would reject outright. But in the meantime, it will be tough. There's no doubt about that.
Ian, thank you so much, and thanks for sharing such a positive view on what is a pretty tough time. But I think it's so important for us to focus on the positives. It's so easy to get drawn into the negatives. So really appreciate your time this afternoon, mate, very much. Look forward to seeing you face to face sometime, perhaps when we open our borders and let you in.
That's right. When you let me in, when my government lets me out of my house and your government lets me over the border.
We have to have everything lined up. So I thank you so much once again. Take care. And for everyone out there, thank you for joining us. Some really interesting insights from Ian. And I'm sure if anyone wants to hear more, just come back through us. So thanks again, Ian. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. All the best, Steve. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.